I'd like to welcome Jonathan Lyon, Senior Program Manager in Microsoft's Identity and Network Access Engineering Division. Hey, Jonathan.
Hi.
And Rob Barnes, Senior Developer Advocate at HashiCorp. Hey, Rob.
Hey, how's it going?
And we'll be talking about how HashiCorp and Microsoft are working together to make Zero Trust accessible, leveraging identities in a multi-cloud world. So let's start at the very beginning. Zero Trust is everywhere. Rob, can you help me understand what that means in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good idea to kind of set the stage with maybe a bit of a scenario to look at maybe how things have typically run within organizations. So if we take a developer, for example, who is working remotely that needs to access some workloads within the network perimeter, typically they would use something like a VPN to access that network. And at that point, they will be able to access any of the workloads that they require to perform their function. So that's a pattern that has been quite common across organizations for the past couple of decades at least. And essentially what that pattern is doing is it's trusting everything inside that perimeter. The issue is when you get into a cloud environment, we have this thing called the shared responsibility model. So now there isn't such a rigid perimeter that you're used to governing. Essentially, some of that responsibility is going to be down to the cloud provider. In this case, it will be Microsoft Azure. And you don't have full control over how they manage that. So now it's no longer enough to authenticate your identity via a VPN and have access to everything. Now, every time you want to access everything, we need to just double check whose identity it is and make sure that that identity is in fact authorized to access a particular system or workload or whatever it is you're trying to access. So it's just kind of more of a mindset shift. The rigid perimeters that we're used to, they no longer exist when we start moving into the cloud realms. And now we have to start looking at things from more of an identity mindset.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So in this scenario, what are some of the key challenges customers have implementing Zero Trust security?
Yeah, so I think, so we use the scenario of a developer, and I think one of the things that I've learned throughout my career is that in order to do a good job when it comes to security specifically, it's heavily centered around providing a good developer experience. If you make things difficult for developers to, do their jobs, do the basic things that they need to do within their roles, essentially it's a barrier to adoption specifically. So that's the first challenge there. And secondly, I think you have to look at the developer workflows and you need to try to find ways to bring some of these processes into the things that they're already doing without adding too many additional steps. Like essentially what you want to do is you want to reduce the complexity for the end user or the developers in this case. So that's a really, really key point to emphasize there. Productivity is the thing that you cannot afford to disrupt when it comes to your audience in that sense.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Rob, I think often organizations, it's knowing where to begin is one of the more challenging parts of the Zero Trust model. That I think a lot of people are getting the concept now. We see recent stats where 64% of CTOs are already looking at building a Zero Trust plan, but often it's where to actually start. And I think the developer scenario you gave is a great experience because they tend to be more privileged users because of the nature of their work. So really what we need to start looking at is, well, we need to verify explicitly. We need to ensure that that developer is that developer. We need to ensure that the device they're using is trusted, it's healthy, it's patched. If it's a tablet or a mobile device, it's not got a rootkit or something like that on there. And then of course, least privileged access is crucial. It wasn't that many years ago that if you brought a developer into your organization, you made them a domain admin or a global admin because they needed to access servers and lots of resources and being able to install software. That causes a world of problems. So ensuring that least privileged, make sure they've got enough to do their job, but actually make sure they don't have too many permissions.
Yeah, that's fair. And you brought up a really important point there, Jonathan, the starting problem. Where do you think our customers can start? Where do you recommend organizations start when implementing zero trust security? And is there a framework to follow?
There is, yeah. So it's a really good question, and it isn't as complicated as it might seem. Obviously, one of the problems we have, as Rob mentioned right at the beginning, is that move away from being in an office. You know, we're all working from home predominantly now because of COVID and because of working changes. We're no longer potentially using VPNs. So those bubbles where we could contain everything and everything in that bubble is all okay, that's gone. So what we need to do is take that complicated matrix and simplify it. And the simple way to do that is using identity to start with. And with Azure Active Directory, we have a policy engine called conditional access. And that allows you to build your policies around what people can access, how they can access it. So as a starting point, the key point is creating an inventory of your application and workloads. Understand what your users, your developers are accessing. Once you've got that, you can actually break it down into a who, how, where, and what scenario. So who, they're your users. Is it a developer? Is it an end user? Is it a guest user from another organization? Or even, is it a workload identity? So a server-to-server identity. How is it accessing? Is it a corporate provided laptop? Is it a mobile device? And also, what client app? Are they using a browser? Are they using a rich client? We can then look at the where. Are they on a VPN? Are they on a home network? Are they in the office? Are they on an unsecured Wi-Fi, like in a coffee shop? And then the key bit is that inventory piece, the what. What are they trying to access? And using those sort of 4 columns, you can then start shaping what users need to access, what workloads, and define that how and where, your policy bit, as to how they can access those or how they can't access those in certain scenarios. So based on those, you're able to build a decision on that what, the workload.
Yeah, that seems to make things easier to follow. They have a set of steps you can think through. That makes a lot of sense. Can you both talk about the importance of identity-driven controls in terms of zero trust security in the cloud? I'll start with Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go back to the original scenario, in fact, what I'll actually do is just to latch on to what Jonathan said. I think he set the scene very, very well, talking about some of the pillars there. And I think that is the kind of mindset we need to take when we're talking about identity-driven controls. So essentially, we're talking about, service-to-service communication. We're talking about human-to-machine communication. We're talking about machine-to-machine communication, and essentially, you're looking at things like single sign-on. So there are some pillars that we should think about every single time we're trying to implement a zero trust mindset to our systems, our infrastructure, and our applications. And it sounds, I think, just like Jonathan says, it sounds a lot more scary than it actually is. But I think even if we look in the traditional kind of castle and moat approach, we were doing it already. If you look at what our firewall rules look like, it was normally via IP address. And if we think about what that IP address represented in that world there, it was an identity for an application. So you'd have a virtual machine or even a bare metal machine. It would have a specific IP address, and it would have a responsibility of running a particular application or workload. When we go onto our firewall and we allow the IP address to communicate with something, essentially what we're saying is that identity can speak to something. So it's just getting your head around that. It's the same kind of thing, but instead of looking at things like IP addresses now, which is a lot harder to do in this cloud native world, essentially the IP addresses are a lot more dynamic and a lot less predictable. So we can't really manage a rule base of things that are forever evolving. So it's important just to understand that we need new ways of assigning identity to our workloads, which is operating in a more dynamic and fast moving pace that the cloud enables us to move in. So, like I say, you want to just control what can talk to what. You want to control who can access what. And essentially, if you have a single database that you can trust as your identity provider, so Jonathan made a very good example about Azure Active Directory. This is a great example of something that you can use as a single sign-on. And one of the other challenges that I tend to find, and I've run into this so many times in the past, is essentially authenticating humans is, I'd say, especially with things like Azure Active Directory, is very much a solved problem. We have our identities in this database and we can, authenticate, we can use our usernames and our passwords and add extra layers of authentication like multi-factor authentication to that. But where the biggest challenge comes in is authenticating our applications. How do we securely assign an identity to our applications if we're not going to use an IP address, which we can't use if it's dynamic? And this is one of the reasons why I really, really love working with Azure personally, because one of the most underrated features, in my personal opinion, of Azure is a feature they have called managed identities, which is super nice. It's a way of assigning an identity to a workload, a virtual machine, whatever it is, and you can assign granular permissions to that. So with that, it means that when you're authenticating that virtual machine to other services within Azure, that initial kind of secret zero injection piece is taken care of. Whereas without something like managed identities, you need to find a way to inject some kind of identity into that. And there aren't many good secure ways of doing that. So definitely it's something to look into. Azure managed identities is, for me, the way forward, I think.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Rob, we've recently announced that within our governance tools, within Azure Active Directory, we're now including workload identities. So we can actually see which developers own those workload identities. We can ensure that they're not being used for anything else. They're not being sort of repurposed, those sort of bits, using access reviews. And again, that auditing process can ensure that that least privilege is happening on those workload identities as well.
That's fantastic. So now I want to hear how Microsoft Azure and HashiCorp are working together to make Zero Trust accessible, regardless of where the organization is in their journey to the cloud.
Yeah, I can kick this one off. So, I've been a big fan of HashiCorp for many years, long before I joined the company and started working here. And I've also been a big fan of Azure. It was actually my entrance to the cloud world. So I've been doing a lot of things with HashiCorp and Azure collectively. And if we look at some of the integrations that have been put in place between the two of us, we can see that HashiCorp and Azure have worked really closely together to align on the way that we deal with some of these security issues, how we tackle the issues of assigning identity. So we have quite deep integrations, specifically with things like HashiCorp Vault, which is one of the areas that I specialize in. I can probably talk in a bit more detail about that a bit later on, but we have multiple layers of integration with HashiCorp Vault. Boundary is one of the newest open source projects that we have, and you can now log in to Boundary using your Azure Active Directory identities and the managed group feature that we have. So this is super nice. It means that you can just manage all of your identities in that one place, which is going to be Azure Active Directory, and you're going to be able to access HashiCorp Boundary to get access to the rest of your workloads, which again is super nice. And we have things like Terraform. It's leveraging the Microsoft Graph API for managing a Active Directory permission structure, which is again, another evolution in the whole identity approach. Just to kind of elaborate a bit more on things like Vault, this is probably the area I have the most knowledge in and the most commercial and practical experience in. Essentially, the first integration I can probably talk about, which is the obvious one, is the Azure authentication method that we have, or auth method is how we call it in Vault. And it takes the same principle as what I've described with Boundary. You can literally take the identity database that you have in Azure, and you can use that to log into HashiCorp Vault. So the reason why that's nice is the last thing you want to do is to manage your authentication and your authorization in multiple different places. It creates a kind of an identity sprawl, and it's a nightmare to manage. As you have to remove permissions in one place, you have to remember to replicate that in different places. So managing that centrally is a key pillar. So using Azure Active Directory as your identity provider is a great way to have a source of truth for identity. You can also do things like we have the Azure Secrets Engine. So if you need to authenticate with Azure, instead of giving people long-lived credentials, like service principal credentials, essentially what Vault can do is it can go to Azure and create a short-lived dynamic credential for you to access Azure with all the permissions you need for that specific task, and it can give that to you. Now, I mentioned that it's short-lived, and that's because it will have a time to live associated with that credential. And then once that has expired, then Vault will go to Azure and say, hey, can we revoke this credential? So that way you don't have to worry about secrets being sprawled everywhere. You don't have to worry about, credentials being leaked or anything like that. So that's a super nice feature. And then we have some other things as well, which, it tends to get overlooked, but we'll talk about things like auto unseal. So anyone that's familiar with HashiCorp Vault, in general, when you first bring up a cluster, it's in a sealed state, which is to protect everything that's inside it. And in order to unseal it, you would normally enter a quorum of unsealed keys, which will open up the cluster and allow people to authenticate and interact with Vault. And that is good from a security standpoint. But from a more operational standpoint, that can be a nightmare to manage, especially when you have server restarts in the middle of the night and on-call engineers have to be, woken up to enter unseal keys. So we have a feature called Auto Unseal, which essentially, in this case, you would use Azure's Key Vault as kind of your unsealing key, and it would automatically go in and unseal that. So that is super, super nice. But it brings about the problem of, well, how does Vault authenticate with Azure, right? So we have that same issue I mentioned earlier on about the secure introduction of Secret Zero. And this is where I'll talk about it again, managed identities. We have support for the Azure managed identities in Vault. So as long as you're running HashiCorp Vault in Azure, you can assign a managed identity to it, and that will automatically authenticate with Azure and have access to the cryptographic key in Azure Key Vault and allow your cluster to automatically unseal. So, there's a lot of work that's happened between HashiCorp and Azure to make this seamless experience between our offerings as easy to use as possible for the end user, for the operators, and for the developers. I think it's really, really good what we've managed to achieve together so far.
It really is, Rob. And just to sort of add on, right now, if we look at Vault and Boundary, they support Azure Active Directory as an SSO provider today. And soon they'll be available in the Azure AD App Gallery. So you'll just be able to go into Enterprise Apps and add those to your Azure Active Directory tenant straight from there. As soon as you've done that, whether it's Vault or Boundary, becomes an enterprise app within your organization. And what that means is you can create a conditional access rule. So obviously, if we look at Boundary or Vault for that matter, they are privileged workloads. They allow you to access secrets or remote access workloads that are potentially sensitive, maybe hold data or key business systems. So once we've got the single sign-on working, you can create that conditional access rule where you can verify the identity. What groups are they in? What roles? What location are they in? And don't forget, this isn't just human identities, it can also be workload identities. So coming back to those managed identities that Rob's quite passionate about, which I'm pleased to hear, you can actually specify potentially what regions they're in. So actually, yes, I'm going to allow this managed identity to talk to Azure Key Vault, but only if they're both in the same region. And that way, if that managed identity tries accessing something from a different region, it wouldn't be allowed in. So location isn't just necessarily about where you're physically sat, it can also be used with those workload identities. We've also got risk. With Azure Identity Protection, we can look for patterns using our machine learning models to look for risks such as lateral movement. We can look at situations where impossible travel or unlikely travel has happened, or even potential credential theft, where credentials are available for sale on the market that could be linked to that identity. And once we've verified that user, it's about authentication. And the key thing here is authenticating with strong auth. Now, typically strong auth is seen as MFA, and I'm a big advocate for MFA, especially if you were accessing something quite sensitive like Vault or Boundary. But we talked early on, and Rob mentioned about not interfering with the developer getting on with their job. So maybe they don't want to have to get the authenticator app out and do an MFA challenge every time. So there are other options, including passwordless technology, where if they've got say a Surface device, they could use Windows Hello, they could use a FIDO2 security key, or biometric devices such as fingerprint to actually do the authentication and do that second verification for them. And if you're using something like biometrics or Windows Hello for Business, it doesn't interfere, because as soon as you go to access Boundary, the camera's going to look at you, check you are who you say you are, and let you in. So you're verified. Once your user's verified, we can then talk about verifying the device. So we can check that it's healthy, that it's been patched, that it isn't, jailbroken or something like that. So we can actually ensure that the device is healthy. And once we're happy with those, we can have a policy that says you're allowed to access Boundary or you're allowed to access Vault, and actually provide that sort of first layer of protection into Boundary. Then once you're into Boundary, you've then got the secure methods that provide to access your various workloads in Azure or any other cloud for that matter. So it's really, really providing that protection to get you into that secure platform like Boundary or Vault, and then moving you on.
I just wanted to latch onto that and just add, just to make sure that I'm getting the point across, is when we think about how do you go about implementing a zero trust mindset to your organizations, I think everything that we've said so far, it should kind of give you a common theme, which is you do this by managing things centrally. So if you think about your identity, you want to manage that centrally in one place, right? Which is why this integration with Boundary is such a key thing. And the fact that you're able to just go to the marketplace and actually add all of these things here to your applications just makes life so much easier. You think about how you're generating credentials, dynamic credentials. You want to do that centrally. You want to manage your secrets centrally. You think about how are you accessing workloads via Boundary? Well, that's again a central piece. So what you want to do is you don't want to sprawl the responsibility of all these different things across so many different places. You want to manage them centrally, which is why the integrations are such a key point of interest here.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jonathan and Rob, for taking the time today. Really appreciate it. This has been really helpful, a lot of information there, which I'm sure a lot of our customers can use. Zero Trust Security and how Microsoft Azure and HashiCorp have come together to help play a critical role with identity and Zero Trust becoming accessible. Thank you.